Hi, and welcome back to Lean In Leaders in the Lean In Leaders studio. I am Shad, and I'm here with my partner, Larry. We're back again. And Larry, we've been gone for, I don't know, a minute or two. So what's been up? What's been going on with
We
you?
go through phases, you and I. Yeah,
Yes.
which is, our listeners know too, and the people who follow us on our Lean and Leaders LinkedIn page. That we probably share more digital content than we do our interviews or just our conversations in the studio. But today we are going to be doing that. But yeah, well, I've been busy with a lot of projects, just like yourself, and it
Yes, sir.
took my Elevate Human Capital full time to a leadership development and coaching consultancy, and um, a lot of projects in the hopper, just like yourself. But it's good to see you.
Congratulations.
Yeah,
Yeah, you same here. Yeah. We stay in touch pretty often, but you're right. We don't do this near as not as much as we should. I think that's a commitment we always kind of make, and then life gets in the way, but that's all good. So you've talked a little bit about Elevate. It's your
yeah,
primary business.
yeah. I'll make it brief. So. Elevate Human Capital LLC, really three core services. I'm trying not to be everything to everyone. First core services is executive coaching, which is not the most unique thing in the world today because a lot of people like yourself and others do coaching. Just put my own spin on it. I use a performance model, a mental performance model that I've been working on, and I integrate that into my coaching services. But that's been really robust and fantastic. And I also have a leadership academy, which is a 1-year program of which you're faculty.
Yeah,
And we have
yeah.
some exciting things with that program. And then I have a talent management capability that is a really what I call modernized talent review, which is also offered through the
Which
consultancy.
is
Yeah. So
phenomenal. Yep,
thank you so
yep.
much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yourself, you've been,
So yeah, kind of the same working projects. A couple of conferences I'll be working this summer, talking about leadership development. My focus in the coaching industry is really working with those first time leaders, and I think that's where a lot of the stuff that we talk about really has that tangible benefit of how do you take and apply this to someone who I had a conversation the other day with somebody. Nurses and therapists are not taught leadership in school. We're taught clinical work. And so you either learn to be a good leader based on the people you worked for or worked with, or you're taught really bad leadership skills. And so it's kind of a walk and
yeah,
draw in what you take from it. And so a lot of my work and my dedication is on trying to take those frontline first time leaders and teach them how to be more efficient to get the training that an executive leader gets, but on a one-on-one level. So yeah, so just working on some of those
congrats.
projects, a couple of book ideas working on. I'm working on an app that'll come out sometime, hopefully later this year, on just health and wellness. So we talked a couple weeks ago just by phone as we discussed the need to get back into this studio. Or we kind of had a conversation. You had some ideas around this idea of stoicism in leadership and this philosophy of stoicism.
Yep.
I think that's a great place to kick off. So I think let's jump into that. What is it, and kind of a high level overview, and maybe that leads itself into kind of a series of future podcasts, which then will mean that we actually will do this a little bit more often.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah,
so
for
jump
sure.
on that. Let's talk about that a little bit. What is stoicism?
So, you know that I started my PhD in performance psychology last year and on a current break, but being the ever green learner that I am, I still keep studying. And I, there has been something over the past 6 months in particular that has been like a gravitational pull toward ancient philosophy. So before
Okay.
psychology,
Hmm.
we had
Right.
philosophers, right? But what has
Right.
been intriguing me more than anything over the past 6 months was Stoicism. It is pretty topical today. And I mean, there are a lot of podcasts, there's a lot of content sharing on all kinds of platforms about Stoicism. It started hitting my feed, my YouTube feed. And I'm like, what the heck? I know about it, but I don't know about it. So I started diving in. I'll be honest, my own understanding of even the word is literally just that buttoned up quiet, more reserved, stiff upper lip, emotionless
Yes.
individual.
Which is not what it
Right.
is.
So is that what you think it is as well? Right. At least
Yeah,
at face
that's what I've
value. Right.
always thought. Yeah, I actually had it's interesting you say that because I actually had one of my kids had a significant other, or they were in a relationship, and one year for Christmas, the girlfriend gave me this book called On Being a Stoic, or I was mildly offended. I'm like, "I'm not quiet, I'm not emotionless." And until I started reading the book, I was like, I am actually some of those, but it's not what I thought it was at all. It's not about being
Yeah,
emotionless.
and so let me also say this, and I know you know this, and I'm just saying this for our listeners too, that and I know neither or nor you, I am not claiming to be like a Ryan Holiday, modern day Stoic philosopher, expert. It is just something that is super intriguing to me. And it is something that I think has high value. And it's something that when you and I first talked about this a couple of weeks ago, as you mentioned a few weeks ago, maybe that we said, hey, this is Lean In Leaders. We talk about everything and anything related to leadership. We always try to, you know, thread that needle and thought to myself, what's the intersection of Stoic philosophy and modern day leadership, which I think if we were to title this conversation or this series is going to be the intersection of Stoic philosophy and modern day leadership, because that's why. So first, again, I'm not an expert. I don't claim to be. There's a lot of great podcasters and content experts out there that do share it. So we encourage people that if they're interested, like follow those people, buy those books, but we're going to talk about it based on the knowledge that we have.
Yeah.
And
Yes, exactly.
so here's what it isn't. It isn't about the overly quiet, reserved, emotionless, despondent, like whatever words we want to use to describe the person who, in our mind's eye, when most people think of someone who's stoic, that's what they think of, that quiet, reserved, maybe not overly, that person that doesn't emote a lot.
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
you start realizing, and then along with that, and this is where psychology starts to breach in when people think about like, oh yeah, Stoics, like they suppress their emotions. And then what you start learning, when you start digging in, you don't have to dig very far, is that in the reason people get drawn into Stoicism in modern day psychology and just the ability for people to access the principles of Stoicism and apply them to everyday life is because they realize that no, it's highly practical. And at the surface level, you realize right away that, wait a minute, it's not about emotional suppression. It's about emotional regulation. And
Yeah,
once people hear that, they're like, ding, ding, ding. It's like, oh, I can relate to that
yeah,
because
and very applicable to leadership,
it's right
right? That
101. I mean,
regulation thing.
half the
Yeah,
time when we're coaching people, even if it's coaching someone who is, moving to a first time senior executive or C-level position, and they have to start thinking differently and think about how they allocate their time and make decisions and all the things that you have to think about when you traverse the leadership pipeline, how you manage your emotions and how you project composure and how you interact and deal with other people is central to your success in that respect, right? So it's not about what we think it is. It really is about how we manage our emotions and how we make the best of situations, right? And Carl Jung, as a psychiatrist, as an early leader in the psychology space, is connected to that too, with this idea of not what happens to us, but how we handle it and how we manage it. So
yeah.
this is central to Stoicism. And then I think, Shad, when we talk about like, why are there so many books on it? Why are there so many podcast channels that you could subscribe to? I think it's because of the complete pragmatism that's associated with everyday life for people. So Stoicism may have been around in one form or fashion. Again, I'm not saying I'm expert. Someone can come back and tell me I'm off a little bit in my chronology, but
Close
following
enough.
we had Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Those were those Greek philosophers that everyone's very familiar with. And while they may have talked a little bit about what might have ended up becoming Stoic philosophy and principles, Stoicism was really originated by a Greek philosopher by the name of Zeno. And sometimes you'll see Zeno say that he was Zeno of Citium or Zeno of Cyprus. But that's was the originator of Greek Stoicism. And that was in 300 BC. So it starts, it's an interesting story. You may hear different accounts of it, but generally speaking, this is someone who was shipwrecked in 300 BC and basically loses everything. And he ends up wandering into Athens, Greece in that time period. And he hears people talking about Socrates or just, philosophy in that era and that time. And he walks into a bookstore and starts reading, and it might have been the writings of Socrates, but becomes really interested. And he starts to actually philosophize and starts talking about principles that become aligned with what is now Stoicism in the Greek period. And what made Stoicism different is also like where it was being taught. So people will read about if they research on their own that, Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, they have schools, right? Like the
Yeah.
Plato Academy and
Yeah.
other things like that. Whereas Stoicism and where the word originated from was it was basically this. It's also called the painted porch because Zeno and his people that were discussing and originating and debating philosophy about life was taking place in this open, like this painted colonnade. And that is where they would discuss. So Stoa means painted porch. And that's was really the origination of Stoicism. So Zeno was the originator. And then he was Greek. And then what people are typically hearing about today, they think about Stoicism is what is often referred to as the later Stoics,
Yeah.
right? They came, hundreds of years apart, between many of these different philosophers. But the ones that are more commonly referred to today are Seneca and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius was, in the Gladiator, which people always talk about, and I've never seen it. So I didn't even really know
Really?
about him in
Really?
that
Well, then you
context.
have to get that part
And
of
now I
it.
got to go
Yeah.
backwards
'Cause
and watch that.
yeah.
But those were three. And in that order, it was Seneca, and Seneca was 4 BC to 40, CE, followed by Epictetus, who was 50 C to 135 CE. And then Marcus Aurelius came in 121 to 180 CE. Now, the reason it's worth just talking about these three people, in not just because of their contribution to Roman Stoicism and what we think about today as the later Stoics, is that they all had very different experiences. So, and we could go into those, but Seneca ended up becoming under Nero like the second richest person in Rome and was very involved in the political world. Epictetus was a slave and became one of the most famous philosophers. But interesting enough, he practiced Stoicism in the Roman period, but he really was also a Greek philosopher. But he's clustered with the
Yeah.
later Stoics, which are thought of to
Yeah.
be as Roman. And then later, the one that's probably the most famous is Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius was interesting because he was an emperor and a philosopher at the same time. So you had a politician and a Stoic philosopher, you had a slave who was a Stoic philosopher, and you had an emperor who was a Stoic philosopher. And I think that underscores how we opened this conversation up, which is, you know, it's accessible to
Yeah. It's
so many
applicable.
different walks of
Yeah.
life
Yeah.
in terms of what it has to offer.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I mentioned these three the later Stoics. We're gonna talk about these things called virtues, which emanate from one of the core pillars of Stoicism, which is ethics. So,
Yeah.
Shad, one of the things that I referenced was that there were essentially three, let's call them categories or pillars of
Mhm.
Stoicism,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
one is called logic, One is physics, and the third is called ethics. So what we're going to focus on in our discussion is the third category, which is ethics. And when we talk about Stoicism today and its high level of applicability and value to people today, they're really talking about the ethics category because that is the foundation for what's called the four virtues. And that's what we're trying to connect to leadership in our discussion today and in our series. Those four virtues that emanate from the ethics category. But before we do that, I thought since I mentioned each of those three, what we call the later Stoics, even though one was really Greek, there was the three Roman Stoics, one of them, being Epictetus as well, who was Greek. If we just talk a little bit about some of the key contributions. So we mentioned the first one was Seneca. And Seneca, while he had a lot to offer and was really one of the more prolific writers, you will hear people say that Seneca was a better writer on Stoicism than he was a practicing Stoic because of all the contradictions and things that came along in his lifetime, being a politician and in Nero's court, yet, was a Stoic because he apparently was an incredible writer of Stoicism. But there's also some things that he did in terms of practices that are worth bringing up that people may have heard about. And if not, they might want to look into it. One of the things that Seneca talked about was called negative visualization. And this is interesting because this is this idea that you do what we're always told not to do. And he would say, no, think of the worst, right? So think of the worst outcome. So you literally sit there and imagine like the worst possible scenario just to end up proving to yourself that most of the time those things never happen. But it was actually called negative visualization. So that was one of the things that Seneca had to offer that was from a practical standpoint, or let's say one of his practices. One of the other things that Seneca talked a lot about in his writing was daily gratitude practices. So he talked
Hmm.
about that a lot. And then the third thing he talked about a lot, which again, wasn't the only person to talk about this, but it was very prominent in his writings and philosophy, which was talked a lot about journaling. And he emphasized the importance of reflecting. And so
Yes.
that very
Which
connected
is a large part of Stoicism, Stoic thought.
reflection. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And then we talked about Epictetus. And again, that was the Stoic who was really Greek, but practicing in the Roman Empire. And he talked about dichotomy of control. And if when you start to research and learn about Stoicism, that might be the most prominent, maybe the most important feature, which if, later there was conversation in the psychology world, over the past century, which was locus of control, things like that. In the sports psychology, performance psychology world, we call it zone of control, zone of performance. But he talked a lot about dichotomy of control and he lived it because he was the slave. So it was a matter of him figuring out, knowing that he couldn't control his environment, how could he control his response to that
Yeah.
environment? And
Yeah.
and then when we talk about Marcus Aurelius, we talk about things that he has contributed, which is again, he also talked a lot about dichotomy control, he talked about emotional mastery. He talks about duty to others and he talks about acceptance of fate. And there's words that go along with that, like this idea of it's called amor fati, which is just accepting, and embracing all different experiences, accepting fate, and that's necessary for growth. So those are just some of the practices that each of those modern day, later Stoics talked a lot about in their practices.
Yeah. I think that's fascinating because it's all between locus of control, control what you can and understand what it is you can control that and understand the stuff that's outside of your control. You have to let it go. And that idea of just acceptance of fate, duty to others is huge. And then, I mean, I think that it's applicable today and it's just kind of common sense when we talk about leadership of self,
There you
which
go.
then translates itself as we'll talk
Yeah.
later into how does that apply to itself as being a
Yeah. It's interesting too, because I meant to say this, that what I found intriguing about the Stoic philosophy is inward focus. And it seems very self focused, but that's not the end game. The idea is that
Right.
you are working on yourself so that you can serve others.
Yes.
And that's
Yes.
different than many
Yes.
of the, whether it's, efforts to improve self and develop
Yes.
self, where it sometimes
Yeah.
doesn't take that next step, where this is more about preparing you to do good.
Uh,
It's not just to
uh-huh.
stay inwardly focused, it's to be inwardly focused so you can be better for others. And that's
You can show
so
up. Yeah.
important.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's also why they say, and again, you hear and read about this all the time, where it's this idea that stoicism is not just, it's not meant to be read, it's meant to be practiced. So very, very critical. So maybe what we could do today is at least cover at a high level each of the four virtues, and
Yeah.
that will lead us into when we start to talk in the series ahead, when we really start to thread the needle and dive deeper on its application and
Yeah.
integration
Yeah.
of leadership.
I like that.
So cool. So the first virtue is about courage, right? So this is about, and courage comes in different ways, right? So there's this idea of physical courage that, running into they say the burning building, but this is really about having the courage to make the decision to be yourself. And this idea of being true to yourself, today we refer to it probably a lot of like being authentic and being an authentic leader and authentic to oneself. But it's really about this intentionality around putting yourself into difficult situations and doing things and being comfortable with not being in control, like we just talked
Right.
about in terms
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
dichotomy of control. It's also worth noting that when we talk about, when Stoicism talks about courage as a virtue, it's not about recklessness. It's not about
Right.
just, leaning in so hard that there's no thought
Yeah.
about consequences. It's
Yes.
really about doing
Yes.
those things that are just uncomfortable for you as an individual. So
Would you say that courage shows up as we talk about it today? I mean, authenticity is the word that comes to mind, right? Because it is leaning in on and knowing what you're capable of, what you're not, and being okay stepping into things that are hard for you. Is it also some of that formatted in vulnerability? Where does vulnerability play into the
yeah, I
virtues?
mean, I think that might even intersect, you know, a couple of the other, at least one of the other virtues too. But I do
Yeah.
think that if you were to extrapolate what Stoics meant by courage, you could certainly argue that it does mean being vulnerable, because part of this virtue talks about putting yourself in uncomfortable situations. And how do you put yourself in an uncomfortable situation, knowing that you don't know what the outcome is going to be, if you don't muster up and marshal a reasonable degree of courage? So it's putting yourself into
Yeah.
those situations. And if we go back to
Yeah.
what we just talked about this idea of, you know, you're improving yourself in the realm of Stoic philosophy so that you could be available for other people, right? And
Right.
you could even argue that, there's threads of courage that are, connected to any and all of that, because when you're making yourself available for others, you don't always know how others are going to
That's gonna go.
respond.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. Exactly
completely
right.
unknown,
No.
right?
Exactly right. Yeah.
So courage is one of the
Okay.
first of the four virtues. The other
Yep.
is called temperance. And this is, you could suggest that this might be more referred to as like discipline or self-discipline. So sometimes you'll hear that used interchangeably. They say it's a big bucket, and it's really all about self-control. You'll also hear the term self-command, restraint, moderation. It's this ability to push yourself and do uncomfortable things. It's this particular virtue. It's almost sometimes referred to as like the willpower that you bring to the other virtues, because
Sure.
it's
Sure.
anchored in this self-discipline. All right. So, and then Shad, the third of the fourth of the virtues is justice. This is referred to as, and this is going to sound very familiar, the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. So
Empathy.
what's the difference between justice and empathy? But in this philosophy, that virtue is what they call justice. It's interesting because I heard people talk about this as I started to do my research and study on this. It's about you caring about others, even if they don't care about you. And that's interesting because, again, it runs so counter to the generic idea and understanding of what stoicism is when you think it's about someone who's, if you go back to this idea
Yes.
of being uber reserved, and
Yes.
what we're saying here,
Unemotional,
yeah, what
detached.
we're saying here
And
is
it's
like to the
actually the opposite.
opposite.
It's actually being deeper. Yes.
Yes. It's like, no,
It's about
yes,
caring no matter what the outcome is, caring for the betterment of that person. As we talked about it in leadership, caring for that person to be a better employee, a better teammate, to derive a better outcome, to be the best that they can be.
yeah,
And not be attached to what the outcome is, right? That's the other part.
exactly. And they take it
Yeah.
even, this philosophy takes it even deeper where, so it's, yes, it's caring about other people, even, even if they don't care about you. And it's even
Right.
suggesting that we're here, like on this earth, to
Hmm.
actually, like, we're made to treat other people well. And that's
Yes.
really very deep, very heady, but it just, again, runs so counter to this idea that this is an internal philosophy. It's an internal philosophy that you bring in a very external way to make other people better, make environments better, make situations better.
I think I would counter that to say that it's really an external philosophy that is driven solely by your internal, actually temperance, right? As you said, temperance is the driver for how well you do these things. It's how what you, we'll sidebar here for just a quick second, even though we're in here quite deep. Um, if you think about society today, this justice philosophy, virtue, is woefully deficient. I don't think we lead, as a gross generalization. Society today has become very divisive, very me first, very authoritarian in your opinions. And think about how much different the world would be if we could provide this justice, where we, instead of trying to be right, we were okay with being wrong, but we just wanted to make somebody better.
Yeah,
Or we cared enough to care about that person, regardless of who they are.
I agree.
Yeah,
I think we're pretty much
it's
what
huge.
feels like on the somewhere on the opposite end of that spectrum right now, where
One,
where
yeah,
where tolerance is very low for anyone other than your
yes,
own opinion,
yes,
which is
yeah,
oftentimes very strong.
yeah,
Okay, and
yeah.
then the last.
Sidebar.
No, no, this is important. It all connects.
Yeah,
So the last, where this
yeah,
is really setting. This is us setting up what is going to be a deeper dive in connection to
yeah,
leadership and practice, intersecting Stoic philosophy. So we talked about courage. We talked about temperance, which is also self-discipline, self-command. We talked about justice, which is very connected to this idea of empathy. And then the last is wisdom. And so when we think of wisdom, it's this idea that you're comfortable, even knowing that when you don't know the answer, you have a sense of directionally where you're going because you have experience to lean into, right? And it has a lot to do with knowing the difference between what you know and from a academic perspective and what's real according to experience. And I'll give you a really good line that I heard that talks about what wisdom is and this idea of what's different between knowledge and wisdom. And when I heard it, it made a lot of sense to me. So, um, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, and wisdom is knowing that you do not put a tomato in a fruit salad. And when you understand that, you
yeah.
start to understand what the Stoics were talking about when they talked about wisdom. It's not just about what you read
Knowing.
about and what you learn about, but it's this integration, this synthesis of real life experience and those difference between those two things. It's interesting too, because it's not about, it's this idea, and this comes back to this idea of the dichotomy of control as it relates to wisdom.
Yeah.
And that is
Right.
that
Right.
about not caring about things that just really don't matter. Okay. And that so that you can use your time and energy to put into what really does matter. And that's at the core of what was talked about when you talk about Stoic philosophy. It's really understanding how to synthesize your knowledge into real life lived experience. And it's very
Yeah.
heavy. Again, not an
Yeah.
expert in this, just find it really interesting and figuring out how we could lean into that and connect it to leadership. And that's what we're going to be
And I
talking
think
about.
that's got it that in and of itself. I mean, obviously, we've talked about taking these values and breaking them down into longer sessions because there's so much to pull out each one of those. But within that value of wisdom, not only is it taking your knowledge or lack thereof and applying what makes the most sense based on what you know and being okay with what you don't know, it also making sure that you're not applying a negative filter from a previous outcome to try to predict your future outcome.
Oh, yeah.
Does that make
Yeah, it
sense?
does. It does.
I
Actually,
mean,
that's
there's a wisdom in just going, there's a wisdom in saying, this happened last time, take a management experience. Last time I talked to this associate about X, they got really upset. So this time when I talk to them, they're going to get really upset. That's not necessarily true.
exactly.
The value in it is to say they got upset. Let me figure out what I know about that and how do I apply this differently so that I can get my message across or so I can get collaboration. And then having the justice and the temperance to apply it that way and to be compassionate enough to do it in a manner that's going to make a
Yeah,
difference.
and manage your, you regulate your emotions along the way, and that's how it all
Yes.
starts in. So,
Yes.
and again, if it wasn't clear, like wisdom in the context of leadership as a kind of a dropping some seedlings here has a lot to do with our judgment, making
Yeah.
decisions, discerning what's important,
Bias.
and really just even how like we biases and how we manage our impulses around making
Yes.
decisions. It has a lot to do with how you lead yourself and other
Yes.
individuals as well.
Yeah. Well, yourself, I mean, to go kick it all the way back to the stoic part, how you're leading yourself first so that you show up better for those
Exactly. Yeah,
others.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I love it. I think this has got a lot of stuff that we can really dive into. And I think for, kind of tying this back to leadership, some of the work I do with emerging leaders, the work that you're doing with organizations, really teaching people how to become more reflective and understanding where your gaps, where your holes are, and what you can do. I think we dive into each of these in future episodes. I think there's a lot to really unpack here.
Yep. I agree. I
Yeah.
think this is going to be interesting. And again, if we leave people with one thing that has
Yeah.
been that has I think there's a book with this title, and I'll leave people with two kind of drop the mic things to think about and walk away hopefully feeling
Yeah.
inspired.
Yeah.
And one is the growth is in the struggle,
Yeah.
and the other is the obstacle is the way.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
All right.
No, I think that's 100% it.
All right. More to
Yeah.
cover on this. And
Good.
what we'll do is again, we'll take a look at each one of these
Yeah.
virtues, and we'll start to really integrate and look at the intersection of Stoic philosophy and modern leadership practices.
Okay. So if you've made it this far, as we always say, know that this is a great way to start thinking about how you lead yourself so that you can lead people better. Hopefully you pulled a few things out of there. You got a couple drop the mics from there, which I think were very, very apropos. I would encourage you to kind of do your own research on stoicism, but understand that we'll be back soon to discuss those four virtues, how they really translate to leadership and give you some tools to guide and direct yourself a little bit better.
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm not an expert in the philosophy. I'm just intrigued and drawn to it like a
Yeah.
massive magnet. And I'm going to, what I want to do in my own life and practice and even how I coach and
Yeah.
consult with people is think about how do I use those really sticky practices and not just read them and talk about them, but live them.
Right.
All right. Well, Shad, hey,
Yeah.
listen, I look forward to our next session when we start digging deeper into the virtues.
Yeah. It's good for us to connect again. I look forward to talking again soon. If you found this useful, you have a job to do. Like, subscribe, enjoy, share this with other people. And until we talk again, remember to always lean in, leaders.